The terrain north of the beachhead did not offer strong natural barriers as the swamps and rivers in the south, but it still favored the defenders over 7th Corps. The ground generally rises to the north, giving the defender commanding heights, and it's liberally crisscrossed with hedgerows. Fortifications in the field and along the beaches, as well as the large forts at Azaville, Crisbec, and Ozaville, supported German defense in depth. A final defensive line was anchored to the coast at Quineville. It stretched inland along the high ridge to Montebourg and then bent southwestward, tying in with the Méderet at La Ham. This line was part of 7th Corps' D-Day objective, but 5 infantry regiments took a full week, from 8th to 14th of June, to reach and secure it. The 8th Infantry Regiment was to take the area between Montebourg and the Montebourg train station, and the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment was to take the high ground between the station and La Ham. On the morning of June 8th, the 8th Regiment was opposed from the beginning by artillery fire and made contact with the enemy infantry at Neuville-au-Plan, where American forces had already fought 3 times but had not taken possession of the town. This time the Germans yielded the town after a short battle. Beyond Neuville-au-Plan, the advance was faster, until enemy artillery and sniper fire slowed down the regiment as it approached Fréville and Grainville. On the left flank, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment came abreast Neuville-au-Plan and then swung northwest to capture Grainville. This allowed the 8th Regiment to continue north toward Magneville. Company I fought its way through the houses until it reached a fortified hangar north of the town. Having discovered this concentration of German forces, Company I was pulled back in line and dug in around Magneville with the rest of the battalion. The 1st Battalion had also reached this sector and established its position along a road roughly paralleling a creek. Throughout the night, both battalions were under unusually heavy fire, particularly from 88mm guns. The main line of resistance ran along the north bank of the creek, a tributary of the Méderet, with main strongpoints at the hangar and the village of Écosseville. Here, the Germans were making their first real effort to hold, and by June 9th they had begun to reinforce their positions with units that had been rushed down from Cherbourg on bicycles. At 06:30 on June 9th, a coordinated attack was launched against the German line between the highway and the Méderet. A 30-minute artillery barrage preceded the start of the attack, but even so, the 1st Battalion, 8th Regiment, was stopped at its line of departure. The other 2 battalions crossed only the first few fields. Soon, the entire regiment felt the full weight of the enemy's fire from across the creek. On the left flank, the 2nd Battalion of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment led the attack, with the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment following in a column. The leading battalion became so cramped between the Méderet and the 8th Regiment's zone that it had no room for maneuver and was pinned down within 200 yards of the creek by artillery and mortar fire from the front and from the left flank. At Grainville, the 3rd Battalion was also taking losses from artillery and machine gun fire as it was covering the bridge over the Méderet to protect the regiment's rear. Late in the afternoon, Colonel Ekman, commanding the 505th, decided to send the 2nd Battalion across the creek. He asked for a 115-minute artillery barrage, but when the time for the attack came, half the artillery support was pulled away for another mission. Under the circumstances, he canceled the attack. The attack of the 8th Regiment met with more success following its initial difficulties, but at the cost of hard fighting and heavy losses. While the 1st Battalion was still pinned at its line of departure, the 3rd attacked towards the hangar. Company I crossed the creek at a narrow place and charged across the open field. Although the company suffered heavy losses, 2 of its platoons reached the orchards north of the hangar. There, they were stopped by fire from the houses in Lalande. Meanwhile, Company L, that was supposed to protect Company I's left flank, managed to cross the creek and capture the hangar. Company L then came in line to the left of Company I, where they dug in for the night. When earlier in the day patrols had reported Écossaville free of the enemy, Colonel Van Fleet decided to command the 2nd Battalion in the center in an attempt to aid the rest of the regiment. No opposition was met until the scouts of Company E were almost at the creek. Then, the enemy opened up with artillery, mortars, and machine guns. The leading platoons tried to find cover behind the hedgerows. As the casualties increased, some of the men tried to outflank the enemy, but the fire followed them wherever they went. 14 men of 1st Platoon moved so far east that they lost contact with their company and joined 1st Battalion, with which they fought for the next 2 days. The confusion was increased when a false order, reported to have come from the rear, started a retreat along the trail. It drew most of the company back about 400 yards, and after it was checked, less than 75 men remained dug in behind a hedgerow. The company had lost all its mortars, half its machine guns, and between 50 and 60 men. Eventually, Company E was withdrawn to the 2nd Battalion assembly area to reorganize. At 1900 hours, the 1st Battalion pressed the attack, with the support of the 70th Tank Battalion, and this time succeeded in breaking through. The tanks reached the field north of Écossaville and fired into the village for at least 10 minutes before they turned around to rejoin the infantry. On their way back, they found the houses at the turn of the road still occupied and attacked the enemy from the rear. This attack finally broke the enemy's resistance, enabling Company A to move in. About 100 prisoners were taken. It was now 2100 hours, and the battalion dug in for the night. Écossaville had held out all day, but outflanked by the 1st Battalion's drive on the right and by the 3rd Battalion's attack on the left, it was abandoned by the enemy during the night. On June 10, both the 8th and the 505th Regiments resumed their attack. The 8th advanced towards the high ground at Hérouville, which it reached that night, while the 505th moved on Montebourg Station and La Ham. On the right flank, the 1st Battalion was carried by the tanks of the 70th Tank Battalion until they received fire from an enemy force in Hérouville. The village was taken when 5 tanks drove into it, and the 2nd Battalion launched a secondary attack against it from the left. No further attempt was made to cross the La Ham-Montebourg highway that day. On the regiment's left flank, the 3rd Battalion was delayed by artillery fire and the resistance pocket at Lalande. The battalion was able to continue its advance when the village was outflanked by the other friendly units, forcing the entrenched Germans to fall back. In the evening, the battalion pushed forwards again until it received fire from the entrenchments along the railroad and withdrew to stay close to the rest of the regiment. The entire regiment was now on its objective, organizing defensive positions, which it was to hold until June 19th. In the meantime, the 505th Regiment had directed its efforts to dislodging the enemy from the extreme left of the front. This line was anchored in around La Ham, situated on the solid ground which extends southwest from the Montebourg station. This attack was not coordinated with that of the 8th Regiment, and in their respective advances, these two regiments diverged, leaving a gap between them. The Air Force supported the attack by bombing La Ham and the station before the 1st Battalion jumped off at 1330 hours. The artillery support was also effective, rolling ahead of the battalion advance. Despite all the preparations, a number of Germans still held their ground north of the creek and had to be driven back hedgerow by hedgerow. Direct, close-range 88mm fire also inflicted heavy casualties. By 1900 hours, the 1st Battalion had fought its way into Montebourg Station, forcing the enemy to retreat northward and southwestward towards La Ham. The 2nd Battalion followed the 1st and then turned southwest. Resistance stiffened as the enemy was squeezed into the south end of the solid ground around La Ham, and as darkness fell, the attack was stopped about halfway between the station and the town. Colonel Ekman ordered the 2 battalions to organize a defensive position around the station. On June 11, enemy artillery gradually stopped, allowing the 2nd Battalion of the 325th to push forward again. Instead of sending the 2nd Battalion in the north directly against La Ham, Colonel Ekman decided to employ it in a holding attack to divert enemy fire and allow the main attack from the east to succeed. Casualties were high, but as the leading elements reached the first solid ground, enemy fire temporarily slackened. The battalion pressed on through the orchards and hedgerows, but was shortly stopped by small arms fire. A second assault was ordered at 1800 hours. After a 10-minute artillery barrage, the 2nd Battalion entered Le Ham and found the town abandoned. Late in the afternoon, part of the 3rd Battalion had moved up from Grainville to mop up enemy stragglers that had been bypassed by the glider infantry. By noon on June 12th, the line running from Le Ham to the outskirts of Montebourg was secured. It was intended that the 4th Division would relieve the airborne units of responsibility in the Le Ham sector as soon as the coastal area was cleared. But the 4th Division had still not taken Kineville on the extreme right of the front. A battalion of the 90th Division therefore took over the Le Ham sector on the morning of June 13th, relieving the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment for a new mission to the south.